Well, friends, we're glad that you're here today. We want to introduce, on behalf of the Wyoming Interfaith Network, Ms. Shirley and Higuchi, who will be joining us to talk about her book, Setsuko's Secret. Shirley Ann comes to us from Washington, D.C. area, but originally her mother hailed from this area because of the Heart Mountain connection. So you will find out more about that and a lot to do with the Japanese internment facility called Heart Mountain, the relocation camp, whichever you choose to call it. I know some people in this area choose to call it relocation camp, others call it the internment facility. So this is a time in history that we are very curious about, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say and what you have to share with us today, and also about your book. So welcome, Shirley and Higuchi. Y'all can clap if you want to.
Okay, well, I'll be presenting with our interim executive director at the Heart Mountain Wyoming Foundation, Ora Sonata Newlin, who's a Wyoming native and also is Japanese American, fourth generation. So her family was incarcerated in Heart Mountain as well. So right now what we want to do is show a very brief background historical film that'll put the whole book into context. And for those of you who weren't able to read the book yet, it's available at Legends Bookstore in Cody. And you can also buy it online, Amazon.
And
and at Heart, but they ran out. Yeah. Pardon?
They can order it through our store.
Even if you don't have any in stock?
I think we can get it in stock, right? So
at the local college library.
Okay, well, you could find it if you want it. So we'll leave it like that. Okay, so why don't we cue up the film?
Is it there we go. All right, then I'll move it.
I always knew that my parents met as children at a place called Heart Mountain in Wyoming. And my mother, Setsuko, always called it a place of love. It was only after she died, however, that I learned the truth. Heart Mountain was a prison. 14,000 Japanese Americans were incarcerated there during World War II for the crime of looking like the enemy. Setsuko's Secret is my attempt to understand the lives of my family, myself, in the complicated history of the Japanese American experience. Both sets of my grandparents immigrated from Japan. The Higuchis came first, arriving in 1915 from Saga, on the southern island of Kyushu. They started farming in Santa Clara County, California. My mother's parents, the Saitos, came in 1918 and in 1923. They lived in San Francisco's Japantown and opened a store. Life in California was hard for Japanese Americans. State law banned immigrants from owning land, and Caucasian neighbors often resented their success. The children of immigrants called the Nisei had to work extra hard to prove they were loyal Americans. Despite hardships, many Japanese Americans found the good life and made their way in society. Some became professionals and owned their own home, and others excelled in college. But then came December 7th, 1941. After Pearl Harbor, wartime hysteria and racism intensified towards Japanese immigrants and Japanese American citizens. They called them spies or saboteurs, despite the lack of evidence. Then on February 19, 1942, President Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which allowed the military to ban Japanese Americans from the West Coast. Census records told the government where to find Japanese Americans. Signs posted in neighborhoods said they had just days to pack and leave. They could only bring what they could carry. My family was issued a duffel bag with their name and number stenciled on the outside. Shikata ganai, some said, the Japanese term for "it can't be helped." There was little resistance. They were first sent to assembly centers, which were temporary concentration camps on converted fairgrounds and racetracks. Some families slept in horse stalls and were forced to live like animals. This lasted a few months. Then the prisoners rode on a darkened train to one of the 10 concentration camps scattered across the U.S. My father remembers peering under the window shades to see where the train was going. My family was sent to Heart Mountain Relocation Center in Wyoming. Many prisoners wept when they saw their new home surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. Wind and dust swept through the tar paper walls. The barracks had no running water, the bathrooms had no privacy, and the mess hall food was terrible. Summers were sweltering and winters were brutal. The prisoners repeated another term, gaman, which means endure. In spite of this treatment, many incarcerees yearned to serve the country that imprisoned them. They enlisted in the army and fought bravely in Europe and the Pacific. But others stood up for their rights. More than 80 men at Heart Mountain resisted the military draft as long as they were prisoners. They were convicted and sent to federal prison. The rest of the Japanese American community shunned them for decades. My parents and grandparents spent 3 years behind barbed wire. After the war, they, along with many others in the community, wanted to put the shame and the rejection behind them. They never talked about it. My generation, called the Sansei, could not understand why. Only after my mother died did I realize the depth of her commitment to preserving the memory of the incarceration. She inspired me to understand this part of my family's history and my community's experience. Over the last decade, I've been committed to safeguarding against the racism and fear that drove the Japanese American incarceration. It was my mother, Setsuko, and her secret that taught me, and hopefully you, that we can never relax in the fight for justice.
All right, well, that film gives a background on the Japanese American incarceration experience at Heart Mountain. And it is used sort of as background material before reading the book. So it sort of gives you a sense of what to expect. But the book itself, has many, many characters in it. And I think in some ways I'm not doing complete justice to the book because I'm going to talk mainly about my family. And then Ara will talk about her family. And we weren't able to get extra copies of Setsuko's Secret because they sold out, but we do have the Light One Candle where her part of her family history is embedded when Clarence Matsumura, who was a young man at Heart Mountain, actually probably a boy. How old was Clarence when he went in?
Teenager.
He was a teenager. But bottom line, he was, probably not, he sort of grew up, he spent part of his teenage years there and then left Heart Mountain to fight on behalf of this country in World War II. But if you pull up the slides file that it's a PowerPoint, I could start with a little bit of background here. So this is just the cover slide, the name of the book and my name and Ara's name with the foundation. So right here is some interesting historical photographs that sort of put my family characters into context. The upper left photo was a photo that was taken before my father was even born. This was like in the 1930s. On the top, or early 1930s. And then on the bottom, my dad probably there was about, he looks like he's about 5 years old. So that would have been like 19 35 or 6 or something. He's carrying a makeshift gun. That's not a real gun that he's carrying because he's living on a farm, right? So you play a lot of games and stuff. But what's interesting about that is the guy on the right that's sitting there is actually his older brother that was yanked out of San Jose State because they took all Japanese Americans off the West Coast in California. I mean, if you were in school, if you were in anything, you had to move and get out of there no matter what. But what's interesting is you can't see this in the photo, but the two kids that are standing behind my dad are actually Mexican immigrant children. So my grandfather had 14.25 acres in Silicon, which is now known as Silicon Valley today. And my grandfather was a little bit of I don't know, a philanthropist or somebody in his time that would take in and give housing because he knew that a lot of the Mexican immigrants didn't have a place to stay. So my dad was actually fluent in Spanish before he went into Heart Mountain. And he said when he came out of Heart Mountain, he forgot how to speak Spanish, but he knew how to speak Japanese. You know why? Because there were more immigrant populations, you know, housed in Heart Mountain. Because what happens on 14.25 acres, you're insulated, isolated. You don't have a lot of friends come over because it's hard to do that. Okay, next slide. Now, the flip side of that is my mother's side of the family, the Saito family, which would be viewed as more city folk, you know, in terms of their sophistication and the way they dress. You can see the difference here. They look so polished comparatively. But in any event, my grandfather and his family on my mother's side lived in San Francisco, Japantown, and he owned a store in Oakland. That was their life in San Francisco. So when World War II broke out and the 9066 executive order was signed, the first thing that they did was quickly swoop off, you know, all the Japanese Americans on the West Coast, but they didn't have Heart Mountain built yet. So my family was sent to the Santa Anita Assembly Center, which is a racetrack in California. So they essentially converted a racetrack into temporary housing for many Japanese Americans while Heart Mountain was being built. So what's really interesting about these slides is that you would think that cameras wouldn't be allowed inside a prison camp, right? I mean, like, why would you allow prisoners who are so-called prisoners to have cameras? But what happened over the course of the war is that I think the guards and the staff at Heart Mountain loosened the restrictions because they knew there wasn't any real threat of espionage or sabotage. And essentially, they were less concerned and less fearful. So my dad at the time, and he was probably about 11 at this point, actually got a hold of a camera that was given to him by one of his uncles that came into camp to visit them. And he began taking pictures of the family. So he took the picture on the far left of my grandfather at Heart Mountain, staring out into probably the mountain. And the only support they had in that kind of, let's just say it wasn't a well-built barrack, there was a little air leaking in and out, was a potbelly stove, you know. And then here on the right is a photograph that he took of my grandfather, Higuchi, his father, and his 5-year-old sister, Emily, who is still alive today. And she's probably, let's see, if my dad's 91, she's turning, I think she just turned 86. And she now lives in State College, Pennsylvania. So this is the photograph that actually stands in the museum. It's an iconic photograph for many reasons. I mean, one, because if you look at this photograph, it's an interesting photo to see a classroom of just Japanese American kids all sitting together. I mean, even before the war, before they got put in this camp, I looked at some of the photographs of my parents' schools in San Francisco and San Jose, and they were very multicultural. I mean, white, black, Hispanic, and a handful of Japanese. So for a Japanese American kid living on a 14.25 acre farm, this must have been culture shock. that you weren't used to seeing any Japanese Americans. So, but what's interesting is that my mom and dad ended up sitting next to each other, and they really didn't know each other. And but they ended up bumping into each other at University of California, Berkeley, recognized each other from the camp and fell in love and got married. So you could tell that they don't look like they're too friendly with each other in this photo. Especially my dad as he's leaning away from her, you know. But anyway, so next one. So essentially what happened after the war, and this was the government's plan, was that to really get the Japanese Americans to really assimilate and to become all American. And because the Japanese American loyalty and patriotism was challenged, they had, some of them felt they had to work extra hard to prove that. And that really happened in the military. And Aura will talk more about that later. But this is a photograph that was actually taken in the, I would say 1968 in Ann Arbor, Michigan. At that point, my dad had a teaching position at the University of Michigan. But why we like to show this photo is it gives you a sense of how assimilated my family was. And keep in mind, there were no other Asians in Ann Arbor, Michigan at the time that I knew. All my friends were black and white. So that really, at that moment, really makes you feel like you need to choose, you know what I mean? But this photo is just classic. I mean, it's like Leave It to Beaver, June Cleaver. I mean, my mom, you know, look at her hair, look at the pearls, and then she's holding my baby brother with the sailor suit, which was red, white, and blue. You know, the crew top, you know, haircut style of my dad. And that's me right there in the middle, dressed in a very classically all-American dress, you know. And my brother with his little pinstripe jacket. I think that one was like red, white, and blue too, with a bow tie. So when there was, you know, it's a very complicated thing, but the incarceration experience, I think, caused a lot of fracture in the community and complexity. And one of the byproducts of being traumatized by that incarceration experience is probably becoming a workaholic, perfectionism, control. And on the right, that's a photograph of my dad at the University of Michigan. He virtually worked like as a professor 7 days a week. I mean, just researching, going to the lab. We very rarely saw him. So he just sort of buried himself in his work. And then the flip side of me, and that's me on top of Laura Gallagher, who, by the way, I just connected with her since high school in Utah just last week in Park City. But, you know, here my friends are all black and white, and I just assimilated and tried to be as either white or black as I possibly could, you know, depending on who I was hanging out with at the time. And cheerleading was a really good way to do that because it's such a social activity that requires teamwork. So when I talked about the trauma and some of the things that happens when you're a Japanese American that experiences this, there's a lot of confusion, I think. And the other thing that we talk about a lot is that there is a lot of silence in the community. Like my parents never talked about their incarceration experience, which in many ways, you know, leaves you somewhat confused, but also unclear about your own identity because your parents never talked about what happened to them. So a psychologist that I work with, Dr. Satsuki Ina, she was incarcerated herself at Tule Lake, which was one of the 10 war relocation camps. And she's done a lot of research that, you know, when she interviewed children that were actually incarcerated during that time, as adults, there were evidence of anxiety, depression, feeling startled, extreme vigilance, need for control in certain situations. So I learned a lot from her about the incarceration and how it affected my parents just by talking to her. So this is post-war, you know, as things sort of became more settled after the war, although it was very challenging. One of the ironic things is that my mother, who now is graduating from high school and all that, she actually found out that she had an arranged marriage that her father had looked into with a man in Japan after the war. So if you think about how kind of ridiculous that is, you know, here they're put in a camp. She doesn't speak any Japanese. She's American. She looks Japanese, but because of her father being a first-generation Japanese immigrant, thought it'd be a good idea for her to take a ship back to Japan and meet somebody she didn't know in a war-torn country to see whether maybe they might like each other and get married. I mean, the whole thing is just nuts. But I wish I would have had a chance to talk to my mom about that more and question her, because it's like, who would do that to your daughter? I mean, like, seriously. But see, that's probably the way that my grandfather was thinking. First of all, using old cultural norms of Japan where arranged marriages were more common, but also he probably was in some ways survival mode and trying to figure out how he can maybe advance his family or make his family more secure by her pursuing this arranged marriage. Because I think one of the issues my mother faced is that she felt that my grandfather kind of marginalized her as a woman, and she had to do things for her family and for her brothers that her brothers weren't expected. Like, she worked as a maid so she can give her wages to her father so her brothers could go to private schools. That's kind of the environment that she was placed in. So this is her leaving to go to Japan. And this is a photograph of her younger sister, Kathleen, who, by the way, is now 87 years old, or maybe she just turned 88 yet. No, wait a minute. No, she's not that old. Sorry. She's 78 years old, because I was teasing her last night that she was going to turn 80 pretty soon. She was actually born in Heart Mountain. So it's kind of crazy that, you know, here you're a Japanese American person, and now, you know, as a kid moving back to California, and then you find out you were born in Heart Mountain and you don't know why. And she never really understood that, and now has since learned about why she was there as a baby. All right, well, I'm going to turn this over to our Newlin, Sonata Newlin, who is our Heart Mountain, Wyoming Foundation Interim Executive Director.
All right. I'm gonna stand up if that works for you guys, and it doesn't matter camera-wise.
Do you want to be on camera?
No,
Okay.
you since you're showing the slides. So thank you, Shirley. Shirley's story is fascinating in the specifics of it. It's also fascinating in the ways that it can be generalized to, you know, a lot of our stories. There were just over 120,000 people who were incarcerated because of their Japanese ancestry during World War II. And although the specific details of each of our stories are unique and fascinating in themselves, there are a lot of common themes that you hear in Shirley's story. And some of those common themes are in my story as well as, you know, there being some really unique aspects of my family story. So since this event was in Powell and I'm a Wyoming girl, Shirley asked me to come along and share some of my family history, which is also showcased in her book, Setsuko Secret. Next slide, please. Oh, I need to give you a better version of that picture because it's so dark. But how many of you, some of you have read Setsuko Secret, right? Just a couple. Okay, so I'll give the full background. So my family, it's dark, but this is a picture of my grandmother's family in front of their barrack at Heart Mountain, my mother's family. And so in many ways, this is what a typical family looked like at Heart Mountain. My family was different in that my great-grandparents came straight from Japan to Wyoming in the early 20th century, so like 1910 or so. They came straight to Wyoming to work on the railroads, to work in the coal mines. One of my great-grandfathers was a laundry worker. And so I have roots that, you know, my immigrant story started in Wyoming. On my grandmother's side of the family, after working for 30 years on the railroad in southern Wyoming, my great-grandfather retired from the railroad, moved his family to Hollywood, California, just before Pearl Harbor was bombed. Like just before, meaning 4 years before maybe. Settled there, established a grocery store that he called the Wyoming Grocery, the Wyoming Market in Hollywood. We have a sign that it's amazing. And invested all the life savings into that store. And then Pearl Harbor was bombed. And of all places, they got sent back to Wyoming. Like Shirley's family, they lost everything that they had invested, you know, all of their life earnings was gone. In my family's case, I'd like to think that it must have been some kind of comfort, at least to come back home, because this was home for them, different part of the state, but they were accustomed to the weather, whereas Shirley's family and most others at Heart Mountain were totally taken by surprise. They were totally unprepared for that. So this is a picture of my relatives at Heart Mountain. Next slide. And in Shirley's book, one of the characters, real life characters that she follows in her book is my great uncle, Clarence Matsumoto. This is a picture of Clarence. He's my grandmother's older brother. And he's so military service is one of the aspects of the Japanese American experience during World War II that really fractured our community. Shirley had mentioned that there were a lot of internal fracturing, a lot of internal fractures, and a lot of it was around military service, and in a way that was actually placed upon our community by outside powers more than it was more than being something that was, you know, just inherently divisive. So some folks, like my grandfather, volunteered for the military to show that he was a patriotic American, right? Like, the government might not feel that I'm patriotic, but here's a way that I can show I'm going to volunteer to serve in the racially segregated all Japanese American unit, the 442nd. And a lot of young men did that. Other young men, as Shirley mentioned, resisted the draft. My great uncle, you can go back one. Yeah, my great uncle, he did not volunteer, but he was drafted and he went, he didn't resist. And he ended up in a smaller unit called the 522nd. And irony of all ironies, he was part of a unit of Japanese American soldiers who helped liberate one of the sub-camps of Dachau. Actually, next slide, please. This is to hop to the European side of things. This is a camp that was outside of Dachau, one of the main death camps in Germany. And you can go to the next slide, I guess. That's just a picture of one of those camps. And toward the end of the war, actually right at the end of the war, the Germans started marching Jewish prisoners from that subcamp to the main camp of Dachau in what was called, what became known as the Death March, the Dachau Death March. And this is photos of those Jewish prisoners being moved out because the war was coming to an end. And they were, I don't know the history exactly, they might have just been going, you know, to their slaughter ultimately. And that's when the American soldiers showed up. And that's when my great uncle showed up to help intervene and rescue prisoners from this death march. There was a young Lithuanian boy, a teenager at the time, whose name was Solly Ganor. He was on this death march. And he writes in his autobiography about falling down in the snow, thinking that he was, you know, done for. He heard trucks approaching, he heard voices, he tried to cover himself up in the snow, assuming that this was the end, he was gonna be shot. And he lay there, fell asleep, and then he woke up and there was, you know, a Japanese face there to lift him out of the snow. And he was confused because the soldier was speaking English, but he looked Japanese, and he thought, well, did Japan, you know, are you Japanese? Are you American? And ultimately it was an American soldier who rescued him. And that American soldier was my great uncle, Clarence. So Clarence, whose family was still incarcerated here at Heart Mountain, not in a death camp, certainly. We're not making comparisons at that level, but his family was being held behind barbed wire, living in barracks in substandard conditions here in Wyoming, while he was liberating Jewish prisoners who are also being held on the basis of their race and their faith. Next slide, please. The book that I mentioned, Light One Candle, is the autobiography of Solly Ganor, who survived ultimately because of my great uncle. And this book came about because years later, it was in the 90s when, due to a series of events and people trying to match other people up, Solly and Clarence were reunited. They were able to meet each other again, and they recognized each other. And that started a collaboration of Solly writing this book. And a lot of it, we actually have the book here. It's his memoir of living through that death camp, being a survivor. And part of it, he talks about the rescue by my great uncle. Solly passed away 2 years ago, I think, during the pandemic. My great uncle Clarence passed away in 1995 or something, just before the book was published, but they were able to collaborate on it together. And in the last years of Solly's life, he granted Heart Mountain the rights to republish his book because it had gone out of print. It was very difficult to find. And so we just in the past year, we secured some funding from some private donors, and we were able to republish this book with Solly's permission.
Talk about the epilogue. In other words, that we gave a scroll. Right?
Okay.
Yeah. And there's an epilogue. We have another chapter at the end of the book that we wrote.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
So yes, as part of this, again, it's amazing that Clarence rescued Solly, right, from that death march. It is amazing that they then reunited all these years later in the 90s. And then the connection went through to the Heart Mountain Wyoming Foundation, and Shirley's daughter went over to Israel to meet Solly, present him with a scroll from the Heart Mountain Wyoming Foundation, essentially thanking him for letting us republish this book so that more people could experience it. And we've since, maintained contact with Solly's family. One of our board members, Chris Higuchi, recently went over to meet with Solly's children. So these are connections that have been going on for decades now, and it really warms our heart to be able to make those connections in that way. And there's a picture of Clarence and Solly when they were reunited in the 1990s. And so that's my part of the story. That the full story from Solly's perspective is in Light One Candle. There's more about Clarence's life in Shirley's book, Setsuko's Secret. And then Shirley, do you want to talk about the Simpson Institute just to close us off, to bring us back to Heart Mountain and what we're doing now?
That's on the far left is Tom Brokaw, the journalist, and then Secretary Norman Mineta, who's pretty famous, was actually incarcerated at Heart Mountain. That's me, and that's Al Simpson. So that was during our 2011 grand opening. And one of the things that we're moving towards now is we're actually building an additional institute with the Heart Mountain building that's already there. Has anyone of you been out to the Heart Mountain Museum? Okay, so you're familiar with what I'm talking about. And we're building a wing named after Mineta and Simpson called the Mineta Simpson Institute. And essentially this wing where we broke ground this weekend, and we hope to have construction well along its way by the next summer pilgrimage, is going to be a place of healing. All religions, all party, all lines are invited, but it's going to be a place for discussion, problem solving, open discussion, the best practices that we want for our government, and any examples that helps sort of get people to work across the aisle the way that Al Simpson has worked with Norm, who was incarcerated at Heart Mountain. I'm not sure if you're familiar with their history. They actually met in Cart Mountain as Boy Scouts. Al was a Boy Scout in Cody, and Norm was a Boy Scout before he was incarcerated. So they actually were Boy Scouts together in camp. And they've kept up a lifelong friendship and served in Congress. And I think it's a good example of how people who are very different can actually be friends. And that's kind of where we're focused. But so that was during our 2011 grand opening. And one of the things that we're moving towards now is we're actually building an additional institute with the Heart Mountain building that's already there. Has anyone of you been out to the Heart Mountain Museum? Okay, so you're familiar with what I'm talking about. And we're building a wing named after Minetta and Simpson called the Minetta Simpson Institute. And essentially this wing where we broke ground this weekend, and we hope to have construction well along its way by the next summer pilgrimage, is going to be a place of healing. All religions, you know, all party, all lines are invited, but it's going to be a place for discussion, problem solving, open discussion, the best practices that we want for our government. Any examples that helps sort of get people to work across the aisle the way that Al Simpson has worked with Norm, who was incarcerated in Heart Mountain. I'm not sure if you're familiar with their history. They actually met in Heart Mountain as Boy Scouts. Al was a Boy Scout in Cody, and Norm was a Boy Scout before he was incarcerated. So they actually were Boy Scouts together in camp. And they've kept up a lifelong friendship and served in Congress. And I think it's a good example of how people who are very different can actually be friends. And that's kind of where we're focused. But well, I think, is that the last slide? So maybe what we could do then is open it up for questions. And I guess we could just stand up here.
Yeah, sure. It looks like we're on.
Oh, okay. Okay. Does anyone have any questions in the, okay, right here, please.
Well, I'm always curious at what prompted your families to initially migrate to the United States? What was going on in Japan that they didn't want to come here?
Well, I could talk on behalf of my family. I think during that time period in Japan, things economically were getting pretty tough. And traditionally, they always sort of rely on the oldest son to really carry on the family business and name. So my grandfather actually migrated, and as well as my other grandfather, because they were the second, third, or youngest son of their families. And it was really to search for a better life. My grandfather Higuchi actually first went to Peru and worked there for a while, and then went back to Japan, and then actually came directly to the United States after that. But economically, my understanding is Japan was going through an economic turn down at that time, downturn.
And my family as well, you know, for economic reasons, coming here, the men came here. I'll give a little bit of a broader perspective though on Asian immigration generally. I guess all of us, unless anyone is of Native American heritage, all of our relatives came here from somewhere else. And most of the time, it was, you know, for economics, the search for a better life. Sometimes people come here fleeing violence and persecution. But in the Japanese case, it was, a lot of it was economic. You know, my other half is Irish, so my Irish family members came over, you know, searching for a better life. It's a common immigrant story. In the context of Asian immigration generally, some of the earliest immigrants from Asia were from China in the early to mid 1800s, and they were laborers. They provided cheap labor, right? Like a lot of immigrants now. And then the powers that be started to feel threatened by all of these Chinese laborers who were here and putting down roots and maybe viewed as stealing jobs and things like that, and bringing in foreign cultures and being generally threatening because of their difference, right? And so the United States passed the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, 1886, something like that. Kind of bad with my dates. That said, we're not accepting any more immigrants from China, which in effect created a labor vacuum because there was still work that needed to be done, and no one to do it at the wages that were being offered. And so that is what started waves of Japanese immigration. The United States actually was recruiting, I think, immigrants from Japan. And so a lot of the men came over from Japan to find a better life and work in the United States. The women came along to marry the men. At the time, US law prohibited interracial marriage. And so there was what we call a picture bride system, where there were arranged marriages, and a lot of times the women in Japan would only be sent a picture of their would-be spouse, and likewise they would correspond, and then they came over on ships to be promptly married and start their life here. So the women in your family were probably arranged marriage like that.
Well, actually, no, because remember, well, at least post-war, my mom turned the guy down and didn't marry him. But actually, you know, I wonder, not really, no. But what was interesting about my family is when my grandfather Higuchi got my grandmother, he went back to Japan and he knew the family, but it wasn't arranged. They somehow got connected. Yeah, and then on my grandfather's side, on my mom's side, there was a hookup or a matchup with a woman that lived in Japan, but again, they were familiar with the family, and he went back, but he ended up choosing the younger sister because she was pretty, I know, can you imagine going all the way over there and say, oh no, I want you. So that's kind of what happened there, but that's not a technical picture bride. That's going out on a date, right? That's a little different. But what I heard a lot of stories of is that there was a lot of false advertising with a lot of these photos, because a lot of times these men would send photos of them to these Japanese women who were much younger, and you know, in Japan, and then they would come all the way over here on that ship, and they'd get off the ship and look at this guy and go, wait a minute, false advertising. This is not what the photograph looked like. So a lot of women got sort of duped into coming and marrying these guys that weren't what they thought that person was, which I would really be an irritating experience. Okay, I'm sorry, over here.
Yeah, there was a gentleman there at the camp that had a white wife, and she painted or drew, I don't remember which one, drew of the children.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, that's actually in my book as well. I have a chapter on the relationship of Estelle Ishigo and her husband, who named Arthur Ishigo, who was Japanese, he American, and she was white. So what happened with her is that she was married to Arthur in LA, and when he was forced to leave, since they were married at the time, she chose to go with him into camp. And it was a very sad ending. We're actually also republishing her memoirs as well. But she worked for the War Relocation Authority and did drawings and sketches of what was going on in camp. She played in the mandolin band and really stood out because she had this, very bright kind of white blondish hair. And she's really an iconic figure. And we have some of her artwork in the museum. And we're still continuing to collect artwork from her, or having it hopefully donated to us. But that was a tragic story though, because what happened was she was clearly somebody who had post-traumatic stress disorder, and her husband as well. He died when they left and went back to LA or California. They didn't have a place to live. They ended up living like in a trailer park. They lost everything. They couldn't get any job. He died prematurely. And then what happened was people with the Heart Mountain, Wyoming Foundation, Bacon Sakatani in particular, the Japanese American community rescued her in LA. They discovered her in a dingy basement apartment, and her legs were amputated and she had no food. And so actually they started giving her money. The Japanese Americans who were incarcerated with her, and put her into a nursing home and funded that. So is that your recollection as well? Yeah.
The Wyoming PBS did a documentary on her a number of years ago. That was white, oh, good.
Yeah, yeah.
I can't remember exactly what the title.
Days of Waiting. Days of Waiting.
but
Yeah.
I lost my date.
Is that the one that she died like 5 days before it premiered? Was that the one?
Yeah, that's the one. And she actually, I think the director got an Academy Award for that.
They won an Oscar for short form.
Yeah.
And we sell it in our store, right?
Right, the film's available.
Okay. I wasn't aware.
Yeah, it's really sad and beautifully done.
This morning, I just happened to turn the TV on and there was a gentleman that was in the camp and he had joined the service. Yes, and when he come back, he wanted to be a in the movies. And he wanted to be in the movies, and so he was. But all the parts they gave him was really lousy. But it was very interesting. But
Was that who?
Do you
Did I
remember that
catch
show?
I didn't catch his name.
I bet it's the fellow that played on Star Trek.
Oh. But
He
what
wasn't
was
in
the
this
child?
He wasn't in this camp. It was
He was in
George-
Tule Lake,
George
but he was
Takei.
George Takei,
Yes.
yeah, Sulu.
And
Yeah.
he didn't, I don't know if he had a military history, but.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
he
think
was
that might be
child,
somebody
yeah.
else that you're thinking of, but yeah. There were a lot of artists and actors that got incarcerated. And that's why when they got into camp, they did artwork and they did, they were movie stars too. I mean, they weren't well-known ones, but they did acting and
He
dancing.
was in a camp and then went into the service.
Yeah, I'm not
I
sure.
didn't catch it all.
But it's wonderful that these stories are being told.
Right.
Memorial Inouye spent a fair amount of time at Northwest College because of his collection of photos that Hansel Beat and Otto. Pardon, is that Rudy Spiegel? Anyhow, and so I spent a lot of time with him because at that point I was basically the archivist and we have a collection of things from him. One of the stories that he told me was when someone saw the photo of everybody saluting the flag outside every morning, the gentleman said, I didn't know you used the salute of Hitler because this was the way they were saluting the flag. My understanding is that Eisenhower changed that in the 50s. But talking about connections, and I'm thinking about some of those little stories that just sort of came out in the course of conversations. I would not necessarily have noticed that had he not shared that.
Well, I mean, trust me, the Japanese American prisoners that were at Hart Mountain were probably told to salute in a certain way. They weren't.
No, that was.
Oh, go ahead. Oh.
So actually we hear Al Simpson tells this story a lot,
Okay.
that used to be the official Boy Scout salute.
Right.
This was a Boy Scout thing, like it had nothing to do with Hitler at the time. Well, it became what I'm gonna do it wrong. It became this after the war. The way Al Simpson tells it is that before the war, this was the Boy Scout salute. And so Boy Scouts everywhere, Japanese American, the Boy Scouts in Cody, the Boy Scouts in Powell, they saluted like this. And then that became also the salute to Hitler. And so the Boy Scouts changed it to whatever it is.
Yeah, I guess it was
this
this like that. now.
fascinating. So it would be interesting. But here's
Two for the Boy Scouts, 3 for week 1.
okay. So part of the interesting thing here is that the way we assign blame and fear is that we could see pictures of maybe Japanese American Boy Scouts saluting like this and thinking, oh, they must be aligned with Hitler. But we don't really see pictures of white Boy Scouts saluting, giving the same salute. And I wonder if we just like, yeah, I've never thought about it, but it would be interesting to like have those photos as well, along with the ones of the Japanese American kids.
Well, some of the younger boys worked in our leaf fields.
Oh,
And of course, us girls kind of took our eye to them. And so it was Valentine's Day, and the boys brought my friend, my neighbor friend, and I heart boxes of chocolates.
Oh, wow.
oh, it's wonderful.
So so what year was that?
I am, geez. Somewhere between 42 and 46.
Well, I was just saying, I mean, so what you're saying is that you were actually here when,
I was probably about in junior high, maybe.
wow, you look amazing. Because that was you're 90 years old. Okay, well you look great. So you remember, so you sort of remember everything then.
Oh, yes.
Wow, that's a real interesting.
Because they were working in our wheat fields.
And what did you think about the camp when it was being built? You must have been a little nervous or wondering what's going on there, or?
No, I don't think so. I thought the people were being protected. That was the way I felt at the time, that you were being protected as raised and you were brought into the camp. So they wouldn't be bombing you or something.
Right. Oh, that's an interesting. Yeah, that's the myth that was out there. It really wasn't for their or my family's protection. It was really, unfortunately, some hysteria that happened on the West Coast where they were ripped from their homes and placed in these various camps throughout, away from inland, away from the West Coast. And but I think that a lot of the messaging by the government got sanitized or distorted, because I think at the end they realized that what they did probably wasn't the right thing to do. I mean, it was unconstitutional. And that's why since then our country has apologized to the Japanese Americans for that false imprisonment, essentially. So
I think another interpretation of that was the fence is protecting them from revenge.
protecting them from what?
That they were protecting them from revenge.
So, and there was another, I think, again, part of the myth of it, because a lot of the former prisoners have said is that, well, as children they were there, and they said, well, because they were told too, this is, you know, for your protection. But then they asked, well, if it's for our protection, then how come the guard towers with their guns are pointed, like how come the guns are pointed inward at us and the searchlights are screening us throughout the night?
There was also a nurse from here, from Powell, that worked in the hospital. Velma Kessel.
I was gonna say, was it Velma Kessel?
Yeah, she has a nice book on that.
Yes, we have it out of the museum as well. So I think we're nearing the end of our time. Did you, were there any questions from anyone virtually?
I don't think so. Let me double check.
Okay, didn't want to neglect anybody.
Anne Marie, is there anything out there that we need to ask? I don't think there is. Did you have any questions?
No, but thank you very much for the presentation. It's been fascinating.
Thank you. We have a question back here, though.
About the volunteer work that your mother did as part of the Heart Mountain process. I sometimes I read books faster than I should, and I probably should go back and reread it because there's some things that I obviously missed. But
Well, I found it fascinating that your mom kept all of this virtually a secret from even you.
Right.
And so that was the whole concept of the book, it's Setsuko secret, right? Like
I
you
understand
had to
that.
uncover all of this post her passing, right?
Right.
And so, yeah, it's really, really interesting when you dig into the book. Yeah.
But yeah, well, essentially the shorter version of the story is in 2005, my mother passed away from pancreatic cancer. She was diagnosed in 2002, and it's pretty much the death sentence for those of you who are aware of what pancreatic cancer is. And on her deathbed in 2005, we discovered while we were trying to write her obituary, like what were her wishes of her last wishes. And she said she wanted her memorial money, her coda, and any donations to go to Heart Mountain. And we were totally stunned, you know, like, why Heart Mountain? It's a place she never really talked about. And I remember my aunt saying, I'm really surprised she didn't choose Johns Hopkins University where they did her, you know, cancer Whipple surgery procedure. And, you know, my brother, well, what about university? You know, all these other places. And what happened later was that I got this phone call after my mother died from Pat Wolf and Dave Reese. I don't know if they still live around here or not. But in any event, they wanted our family to come out to Heart Mountain because they were dedicating the walking trail up where the flag is and the memorial up there to my mother. And of course, none of my brothers didn't want to go, and my father didn't want to go, and he was in no condition to go. He was really grieving on that loss. And I just sort of felt like if somebody's honoring your mother, I mean, regardless of why you wonder why, you probably should go. So I ended up going, half not really wanting to go. And, you know, luckily my son went with me. That made it bearable. But, you know, my experience of getting there and the dedication with the governor at the time who was there, as well as Norman Ed and Alan Simpson, and all the Japanese American incarcerees that were available to come at that time, as well as a multitude of other people. It was really overwhelming and inspirational. So even though I didn't understand the concept of Heart Mountain very well, I think just the experience of the power of place and being there and absorbing that information firsthand is what really convinced me that I should find out more. And that's when I joined the board. And I eventually became chair of the board in I think that was 2008 or 2009. So it's been a real journey. It's, you know, I came into this like how you are reading the book for the first time. Literally my experience after my mother died was what you were experiencing when you were reading the book. It was uncovering a mystery of why my mother never talked about her incarceration experience. But what I found out later was that she was secretly, before she died, secretly donating money to Heart Mountain, of dreaming of something to be there, be created there. And she actually was instrumental in purchasing the first 50 acres that the museum now sits on. So, you know, so it's my discovery of learning what she was like and what she was doing after she died, which is, you know, it's very difficult. I mean, it's like being in therapy, it's being in a kind of a healing process, you know, and discovery of who your family really is. And it's, I'm glad I did it. I wouldn't recommend it to anyone. If you got a problem, just tell your kids when they're born. Don't let them wait after you die to figure stuff out. But anyway.
Well, I have a question. I know that the executive order was overturned. I know that there was restitution made around the Reagan administration based on what was told in the book, and it wasn't very fair in my opinion, but there was restitution made. My question is this: in light of recent Supreme Court rulings that have been overturned, we'll just say it that way, is there any initiative, is there any hope that any of this could be overturned for the Japanese American community? Is anything like that going forth at this point? I'm just curious.
Well, I don't know how, do you want to take that question? Yeah.
So it's a really interesting legal history. In fact, there were 4 cases that went to the Supreme Court surrounding Japanese American incarceration. The one of them that is the most famous, Korematsu versus the United States, is the one that is seen. I'm going to mix up my details right now because I'm kind of tired, but that's the one that is seen as being the one that could be precedent for, you know, other groups being rounded up and placed in camps. And that one actually passed. The Supreme Court said, yeah, no problem here. There was some dissent, but it was ruled by the Supreme Court that this was constitutional to put people in camps like this. And it never was overturned. It was recognized as a mistake. The government, you know, roundly, you know, now it's not even a political issue. Everybody looks back and they're like, whoa, yeah, we shouldn't have done that. But the way that the court is set up, the only way to overturn it is if another case comes along to challenge it. And thankfully, until very recently, we haven't had another case come up that could overturn it by the way that the process works, except this was, I don't know, in 2018 or something. And I think it was Hawaii versus Trump or Trump versus Hawaii, something like that. And it was about the proposal to prevent people from Muslim majority countries to come to the United States. And that was its own issue, and the court affirmed it. The court said it was fine. The Supreme Court said it was fine for the United States to prevent people from Muslim majority countries to come to the United States. But in the same breath, Chief Justice John Roberts said, even though we're saying that this step is okay, this is not saying that the Korematsu case in World War II was okay. And by putting that in writing in a very strange way, it actually overturned Korematsu for the first time. So as of that point, I think Korematsu cannot be used as precedent, but it was a very strange thing for a lot of us Japanese Americans because it also kind of was part of something that allowed discrimination toward another group. So it was, I might have handled that a little, but that's my understanding.
Yeah, I mean, well, I think we're not reading from any notes, and we're doing this strictly from memory, but my understanding is a Hawaii v. Trump case. It's a different set of facts. And we're talking about, is it okay to restrict immigration to the United States versus in Korematsu, is it all right to incarcerate a Japanese American citizen, take away their property, due process, et cetera, put them in a camp without any due process. So the facts don't line up. So I believe that the reference that Chief Judge Roberts made was dictum. It wasn't really overturning Korematsu, but right. it lent some mild affirmation that Korematsu is not legitimate, but it still can happen again, is what I'm getting at. Because what happens with these executive orders and some of these Supreme Court cases, they rest everything on the theory of military necessity or some executive order, a thing that kind of usurps due process in the constitutional process. So I think that the law is still weak in terms of what can be done, because at any time the president can issue an executive order and avoid any constitutional barriers based on military necessity, emergencies, et cetera. Because the executive order is viewed as sort of an emergency order. And as long as that authority exists within the president, it can occur again.
And sadly, personal bias could play into that because there's nothing to protect it from the personal bias playing into that, right?
Right. Yeah, and the other thing is the whole theory of overriding constitutional life, liberty, and due process only is only as good as the people that enforce the Constitution, but it's also as important that the facts are accurate. So what happened was, it was actually the Solicitor General, I believe, under 2 administrations ago, apologized to the Japanese American community and to the US that the solicitor's office actually withheld information that allowed this Supreme Court case and other cases and the incarceration to occur. So there was a lot of information that was withheld by a lot of government agencies, and this is all coming out, after the fact, of course.
And this is happening after Pearl Harbor, a total surprise, a total shock.
Right.
So was 9/11.
This wasn't
but it was a different response.
Right.
Because the president did not dictate this type of executive order.
Right.
And we weren't prepared for 9/11 either.
No, and they didn't know who to fear.
Right. But still keep in mind that I think this happens when you have more of an Asian appearance. Like, these were still American citizens, like whether their parents were German or Italian or French or Japanese, the children of those children of those Japanese immigrants were born in the United States and didn't speak Japanese. I mean, so they've never been to Japan. So to somehow equate them with a foreign country that they're at war with could be really troubling because they don't know anything about Japan.
I don't think those people were horrible. I just think they were caught by shock didn't know what to do. And
Yeah,
they just did what they thought they had to do.
yeah.
I
Okay.
think for
What was
me,
that phrase?
a large part of it is the inequity, because those of Japanese heritage who were outside the exclusion zone didn't suffer in
Correct.
the same way that the Japanese who lived
On the West
on the
Coast.
West Coast,
Right.
wherever that line was drawn, took the brunt of everything.
Right, and they were actually, like Aura said earlier, like if her family stayed in Wyoming, they would have never been put in camp.
And actually, there's an interesting twist in my story too, because my grandfather's side of the family, they were still in Wyoming. And so they were not put in camp, but my grandpa was working for the Union Pacific Railroad at the time, and the railroad fired all of its Japanese and Japanese American workers. So in his case, he wasn't put in a camp, but he lost his job, and everybody, most of the railroaders lived in railroad housing, so they lost their homes like in February in southern Wyoming. So there's an interesting side of the Wyoming history there as well. One of the other dynamics that is always really important to stress is that it's actually a misnomer to say that Pearl Harbor is what was the primary cause of rounding people up and putting them in camps. That was the legal justification. That was the government's justification that, oh my gosh, we just got attacked. There's military necessity. We can't tell them apart. So we all have to, there's no way for us to determine whether or not they're a threat. So we have to put all of them in camps. Where in fact, there had been decades of hostility towards Japanese immigrants, and before that, hostility toward Chinese immigrants, particularly on the West Coast, where these immigrant communities were very successful. And so there had been attempts at, and successful attempts at creating laws to exclude them and exclude them and exclude them from being able to own property and being able to, I don't remember what the other ones were, but there were decades of this. And so Pearl Harbor in many ways was like the straw that broke the camel's back, instead of this main event where everything was fine. We were fine with Japanese immigrants and Japanese Americans before, and all of a sudden we're not. It was leading up to this, and then Pearl Harbor tipped it over the top.
Well, and what's really, I mean, let's be really honest here. I mean, the basis for a lot of that discrimination was what Aura had said, but it really was based on a lot of economics and fear and hysteria, because they didn't round up and imprison all the Hawaiian Japanese Americans, because it would have bankrupted the island, because they were all the workers. So here, the bombing occurred in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Hawaii is still the most vulnerable place where there could be more espionage, yet they made an economic decision. We can't incarcerate Japanese Americans in Hawaii because they're running the Hawaii and they're the workers. But that wasn't the case with the farmers that were on the West Coast, because you know, non-Japanese Americans, in my case, with my family, 14.25 acres in Silicon Valley, that was picked up in a distress sale by their neighbors who were Italian Americans, ironically. And we were at war with Italy, but they weren't put in camps. So it was clearly just the physical appearance that got them put in those camps. And there were a lot of economic issues involved, because the Kerseys took the farm from the Higuchis, my family, and they didn't incarcerate Japanese Americans in Hawaii, where the bombing of Pearl Harbor took place, and so on and so forth.
I'm sorry, would you tell me the dates? I can't remember the dates that you went to Heart Mountain, and the dates that it was over with.
Well, my parents were put in, I was never in Heart Mountain, but my parents were put in Heart Mountain in 1942, and they were about 10 years old at the time. What about you?
1942 for mine as well. My family, my relatives were actually on the very first train to arrive at Heart Mountain, and they were on the last train to leave Heart Mountain. So they were here for the entire 3+ years that it was open.
What year was that?
1942
To 47.
to 45.
Well, 45, right?
We're looking to Ava because she knows the dates better, maybe even
42 to 45.
Yeah, 42 to 45. So Pearl Harbor was bombed December 7th, 1941. The executive order was issued February 19th, 1942. And I think August of 1942 is when the first train arrived at Heart Mountain, and my relatives were on that train.
The last train left in November of 45.
November of 45. Yeah,
Do
Diane.
you have anything that you can share? The other piece of this that is I've struggled with mightily is bringing the Japanese from Peru to Roar and incarcerating them there. Not quite sure about the sabotage and the intrigue in Peru that impacted the West Coast. I missed that somewhere.
We all missed it. Oh my gosh. So I had never heard of Japanese Latin American incarceration until really like 6 years ago or something. And it was at a Heart Mountain pilgrimage. We just finished our weekend of our pilgrimage here, and I met this guy at the pilgrimage who looks Japanese, and his name is like Hugo Valdez or something like that. And he said, yeah, I'm Japanese Peruvian, and my family was incarcerated. And I was like, what? It wasn't at Rower, it was at Crystal City, Texas.
Sorry.
And so there's this whole other history that is fascinating and abominable in really by any account. So just like there was hostility toward Japanese immigrants and Japanese Americans in the United States building up to World War II, similar dynamics were happening in Central and South American countries. And so when Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, the governments in these Central and South American countries were having similar discussions like, ooh, could it be us next? And there was some kind of a deal that was struck between the US government and the Peruvian government, the Panamanian government, and several other countries, where the United States agreed to bring all people of Japanese ancestry from those countries. They were rounded up in their countries. They were placed in a camp in the United States at Crystal City, Texas, and held there. And some of them were used in prisoner exchanges with Japan. So like Japan would release some American prisoners if the US would release some Japanese prisoners, except for they were like these Spanish-speaking Peruvians who are of Japanese ancestry, like never been to Japan. And they were used in prisoner exchanges. Many of them, I think there were about 5,000 people affected. And when the war came to an end for them, for our relatives, when the war came to an end, they got to leave. You know, their lives were hard, but they left. The folks who were at Crystal City, the government didn't know what to do with them because the home countries wouldn't take them back. They're like, we never wanted them in the first place. You keep them. The US didn't want them. And so they actually charged them with undocumented immigration, even though they were brought here and they never had their papers because they were like kidnapped from their countries and put in camp here. So there was some lawsuit that I don't really remember what it was, but somehow they were allowed to stay in the United States, become US citizens. But they are actually still fighting for for redress. They did eventually get a redress payment, but whereas our relatives got $20,000 a piece, there wasn't much money left in the pot. So those 5,000 or so Japanese Latin Americans who were incarcerated, they got $5,000 a piece, which, you know, just the disparity there is it's really insulting. And so they're actually still fighting their case to try and be recognized.
And time out, that $20,000 for the 14.1 acres in Silicon Valley was paid out in 1988-ish. Put that in perspective, though.
Yeah, we did an analysis on, it was actually 14.25 acres.
Sorry.
But we recently did, not a scientific, but a general evaluation of what that land would be worth today, and it's about $65 million.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
I would have had a very different life if my parents were incarcerated in Heart Mountain, you know. So.
Can I ask one last question? I know
Sure.
you're about to get going. And then if anybody wants their books, make sure you hit over there soon because they're going to have to, Miss Higuchi has to get on a plane soon. But you mentioned this sensei effect.
Sensei effect.
Sensei effect. How has that affected you? Like, I know what I read, but how has it affected you?
Well, that's a very difficult question. I would say the way it has affected me is when my mother died, I think I was very unprepared to understand what her incarceration experience was and why she had a need to support Heart Mountain in secret as opposed to not being out. I think it really created in many ways confusion, loss of identity, not really understanding like why my mother was so vigilant and controlling and had certain obsessions that I didn't understand, like her fascination with real estate, for example. She constantly wanted to buy homes and flip them, but it was like almost not making any sense, you know. I always tell this story about when I was 8 years old in Ann Arbor, Michigan. My dad came home from work and he just said to us, you know, hey, is anything new today? Did anything happen? And then my mom goes, I bought a house. So she literally went out when I was 8 years old and bought a house without telling my father, which is, you know, unheard of even today. Yeah, you tend to consult with your partner, right? So your husband or spouse. So I just think it really, for me, it really caused a lot of confusion and probably lack of identity development. Now I can say safely, I changed a lot since my mother died. It was a journey. It was being like in therapy, it was an evolution, and it was a quest for knowledge. And I think I'm more holistic in my thinking now, and I feel more complete. So that's the good news. But thank you very much, and we appreciate you having us here. And also, these books are Light One Candle, and we did an epilogue. There's a photograph of my daughter delivering the scroll to Sally. And it's just a wonderful story, but I hope you'll all also try to tap into my book, Setsuko Secret. So please check it out.
Thank you. On behalf of Wyoming Interfaith Network, we thank you.
Thank you. Oh, okay.
I think I was 14.
Wow.